Welcome to this tutorial on telling stories with infographics. So, in the first video on how to create infographics, you learned what an infographic is, when it's appropriate to use an infographic to explain an idea, and how to create various infographics. In this tutorial, we're going to focus on projects 1 and 3, which is where you'll most likely use infographics to help tell your story or argue your point. In Project 1, you're asked to choose credible sources, summarize the author's main idea, and demonstrate an understanding of the larger conversation about your topic in an 800 to 1,000 word essay. Specifically, you're tasked with demonstrating how the conversation about your topic, an historical person or event, has changed over a period of time. Because you have to cover at least 10 years of history, completing this assignment necessarily entails also demonstrating historically who and what was said about your topic. Since we've already covered why infographics are necessary components of modern essays, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over that here. But I do want to reiterate that a good infographic can help you support your main argument, while it also helps your readers digest a lot of critical information quickly. But there's a difference between a one-off visual that relates a critical fact, like this chart, and an information graphic that tells a story, like this timeline. Since we're working with history, let's use the timeline as an example of how we might track a conversation over time using an infographic, and thereby meet the requirements of Project 1. Let's say that I'm interested in civil rights. More specifically, I'm interested in gay rights and the gay rights movement. My personal connection to this topic comes from my uncle, who was a gay rights activist in the 70s in California. Now, the civil rights movement has a long history. So in creating a visual timeline, I could go all the way back to slave labor, then maybe talk about child labor, then the women's movement, and later the civil rights movement of the 60s, and then the gay rights movement, which really didn't begin until the 70s. But all of this would require that I find sources for all these different periods and read them and try to make sense of the conversation. Anyway, you can see that this is just getting too big. So instead, what I want to do is I want to pare down. I want to focus on the gay rights movement specifically, and I want to focus on cataloging who of prominence has said what about this issue. Because remember, I'm trying to track a scholarly conversation about the topic over time. After identifying several sources using the library resources and NBC Learn, I've gathered my materials, and now I'm ready to create a visual timeline about gay rights. So this infographic is essentially a timeline mapping a conversation about a single event, public pride parades. There's a bit of history at the top of the graphic that grounds the content for the reader, and a key that helps the reader understand the color coding of the map. And then there's a sidebar with notable events in Pride Parade history. At the bottom, there is a literal timeline that's color-coded to the year it represents, and at the very bottom, you see the sources of information from which this graphic was developed. This information graphic details important political and rhetorical turns in the conversation about gay pride events, and thus gay rights generally, so it helps to tell a more complete story. Now, I could take the timeline alone and pull it out and drop it into my essay, and yes, that would be a singular infographic. But it doesn't really tell the complete story. Without the map, the color-coded keys, and the additional verbal information included in the map that maps these changes in attitudes, beliefs, and the conversation about gay pride over time, that single graphic would serve little more purpose than a singular chart visually describing one statistic, let's say. And there's nothing really wrong with that. It's just not all of what you're asked to do in the projects. In Project 1, you'll probably just have 1 or 2 smaller infographics. But by Project 3, you should be able to remediate and extend your infographic you created in Project 1, so that it's more than just a singular bar chart that visualizes a statistic. By Project 3, your instructor will look to see if you designed your infographic to help support your thesis, visualize a series of arguments or point, and artfully tell a story. In Project 3, you are asked to write a thesis-driven essay and support your argument or arguments with an infographic. So let's say in this essay that my overarching thesis is that homosexual couples should have the same rights as heterosexual couples, and that making gay and straight couples equal in the eyes of the law is constitutional and economically responsible. Let's say that one of my arguments for gay marriage is that, financially anyway, it could actually help stabilize the economic base of many states with large gay populations. After I research and collect the data I need to draft my essay, I could artfully render the key points of this argument into an infographic, which would further persuade my audience and visually support my thesis. I'm going to use this infographic as my example. Now, this was created by a company called Column 5. and it demonstrates how we might do this on our own. If we deconstruct this infographic, we see that it tells a very clear story about one of the main points in my essay, the economic inequities, and thus the civil rights violations of banning gay marriage. The author starts with facts. There are 1,138 federal benefits given to couples who are legally married, affecting health care, estate planning, Social Security benefits. These are benefits that gay couples don't get so long as gay marriage is outlawed. Moving down the page, we see the percentages of Americans who believe companies should extend health benefits to same-sex couples, regardless of marital status, and the disparity between that number and the number of companies that actually offer benefits to same-sex couples. Notice here that this fact is represented visually in 3 different ways. First, the number, 73 versus 21. Next, the amount of circle, colored blue, also representing the percentage. And then finally, the corporation is represented by the building icon, and the circles are in the approximate place higher or lower on the corporate icon ladder, let's say, to correspond to the figure they represent. On the right-hand side of this infographic, we're telling a different story. And notice too that taken as a whole, this infographic doesn't just relate individual facts about our topic, but it illustrates those facts in concert with one another, and thus makes a comparative argument within the infographic itself. At the top right, we see that we're now visualizing how much states could gain economically if they supported and approved gay marriage, $16.8 billion in total. This dollar amount is broken down further by state, each state represented by an icon, a color, and a bar length, again visualizing the information in multiple ways. I'll let you continue to deconstruct this and other information graphics as you will, but I hope this short overview has helped you better understand the infographic requirements of Projects 1 and 3, while also demonstrating how to use a single infographic to illustrate a single statistic or fact, how a timeline can help you visually render a conversation over time, and how you can further remediate your infographics to tell a story and support an argument or thesis. Get creative, experiment, see how you can leverage the power of visual design to enhance the persuasiveness of your argumentative essay.